And we're going to be taking attendance, so if there's a group of you in front of the computer, would you please type the names of all of your group in the general chat pod there? That would really help us in taking attendance. And of course, if you need technical support during this session, you can call me or email me, and there's my contact information right in here. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Marcella.
Thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate that. As I said a few moments ago, our presenter today is John Tibbetts. And just a few words about our presenter, who's a very impressive man. He was the co-founder of the Center for Adult Education at San Francisco State University. He was also the Deputy Chief of Party for a USAID 5-year project in Liberia, West Africa, where they established the first public school system. And he has also taught adult education at the University of Auckland and the University of Southern Maine. So we're very pleased that he's with us, today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm awfully glad to have so many participants with us today, and I hope you'll enjoy what we're able to do in this short hour. Let me just say a word about what we are going to do today. There's going to be 2 parts to this presentation. The first part will be related to the evidence-based learning based largely on a research study that was done by Mishkind. And that study, if you're interested in it, can be, you may get it through CALPRO at their email address, which is calpro.org. No, Christine?
It's calpro@air.org.
Okay. And that's, she did an excellent research brief, and it's number 11 that you would look for or ask for if you go on that site on evidence-based professional learning. And I recommend that to you. So we'll say a couple of things about that in part 1, and then we're going to move to the main part of what we're doing today, which is going beyond that brief and look at the one program, the one instructional part that really improves adult learning. First, we have to say that we all agree, I hope, that the purpose of adult education is to improve adult learning. Otherwise, we have no business in being in business. So, in order to do this, what the research is telling us is that collaboration is the key to the most successful and sustaining way of achieving adult learning, and we'll spend more time with that than we will the reviewing evidence-based learning. Okay, I'm going to show you a series of slides. I'm not going to read you the slides because you can read those for yourself. I will talk about what's on some of them, most of them, and if you want a copy of the full set at the end of the program, they can get that. Is that right, Christine?
Yes, those will be available at the end.
Yes, at the end of the presentation on the last slide area, there will be a link that you can use to download a copy of this presentation.
Okay, then let's start. To start with, the research on evidence-based learning, as I mentioned, the research brief number 11 by Ann Mishkind. And what she tells us is there are really 3 shifts in evidence-based learning, particularly for adult education. And one of these shifts is using data to inform instruction. What that means is when the students come to your class, do you find out what they already know? Let's assume for a moment that you're a beginning ESL teacher and you know what the student's going to have to know at the end of your beginning session in ESL, but do you know what they already know when they come in, or do you just teach what that is regardless of whether they already know it or not? So data is very important for the initial stage of adult learning. Once you know what they already know through a kind of assessment, and many of you have already indicated in the answer to the question, the best assessment of student learning, and some wonderful answers on there. I won't repeat them all, but generally you can either do that verbally or you can do that in some other formative assessment way. And let me just say a word about formative assessment for people who may find that as a new term. The difference between formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment means it's assessment for learning. That's why it's formative, rather than summative assessment, which is an assessment of learning. So that's an important difference between the two. In other words, formative assessment tells us what you need to do to improve your teaching instruction, and summative tells you what's already happened, and it may be too late for you to go back and make those changes. Now, in order to do that, Mishkind has recommended in her research that we find out what evidence is there, and then you move on to analyze the results of what they know, and you try some learning. If it was not successful, you go back and start the process over again. And she cites two models of collaboration that are most important. One of these is the communities of practice. Many of you may belong to one of those COPs. The difference between communities of practice, number one, and professional learning communities, PLCs, is that communities of practice usually involve different agencies, whereas a PLC is had in one agency, oftentimes in one program of one agency. The second part, or the third thing that Mishkind cites is that collaboration in the COP and the PLC, the important levels. So I'd like to then move to the second part and what we're really going to spend our time on today, and that is on the levels of collaboration. It's easy to have collaboration among teachers, but by having that alone is not going to improve the student learning to the extent that it will if we have collaboration at all three levels. Level one then is leadership, and which leadership practices appear to be best to increase student learning. And I would like to tell you about a study that was just completed a few weeks ago, and that's on your, should be on your screen now. Two kinds of leadership. The first was directive leadership. That's where the administrator assigns individuals to roles, gives specific directions, and the second kind he called empowering leadership. Some people call that distributive leadership, but it's the same thing. Empowering leadership, that's where leaders who share their power, they encourage dissenting opinions, and they promote, and most importantly, shared decision making. So, looking at those two and the research that was done, what do you think of the two would give you the best over time learning gains? And here's the answer. And the answer says that the direct leaders often achieved the early gains and immediately, but they tended to plateau over time. And some of the reasons that they plateaued was that due to the turnover of teachers, due to the lack of support systems, and the other kind of leaders, the empowering leaders, the students were slower to show learning gains, but in time they eclipsed the direct learners, and after they worked out the collaborative process, they produced continuing improvement in student performance that lasted long more than the direct leaders. I think that's very important for the leadership in a PLC program to know which approach that he or she should take in doing that. So I wanted to ask a question. Do you currently have a PLC program at your site? Would you indicate yes or no and the name of your site if you do? I'll give you a moment to type that in. The PLCs actually fit best under empowering leadership or distributive leadership because in the PLC process that is often messy during the collaborative team building stage, but that team building is very important. The teachers always like to share. That's one of the best results we get from any workshops that's ever done. Oh, we like the sharing. But what they like to do is to share their successes and not necessarily share their failures or share the students' failures in learning. So with a PLC team, they have to learn to do both. They have to discuss what students are learning and what students are not learning. And there are two important things in the PLC that they need to learn. One is what students are able to do, and then what students are able to know, and in reverse order. Actually, they need to know it before they do something with it. It also means that managed enrollment becomes almost a near necessity for a successful PLC. Managed enrollment is the opposite of open entry and open exit. If you have students who are coming in and going out, then it is negative effects on both the students and on what they're learning as well, because you have to go back and reteach them. You all know this. So if possible, I hope you will go to managed enrollment if you're going to do a PLC. So then we come to the question of what is the critical leadership roles that happen for the PLC. The first role that the leadership must do is establish a climate, a change in the climate. The directive leader, you will recall, gave out instructions, everyone followed them, and they knew exactly what they were supposed to do. The leadership role in the PLC is to establish a climate where there is a trust, and the teachers who are making decisions know that the principal, who has not only said the words that he supports it, but is going to support it in actual behavior. So that climate of trust is essential if it's going to be successful. A second role that's for the administrators really interesting, and that's the role of the community. The principal needs to establish a contact with the community. He needs to convince the community that the PLCs that you are doing in your program are really doing what will help the community in finding people who can do the work that they need for hiring. They also need to involve the community in bringing them into the school, let them talk to the students. They may want to provide internships for students or other work opportunities that they can find. But that role of the principal is much more important than what you see on your screen although what usually referred to as principal walkthroughs. And this may not set well with many principals who are, if there are some of you out there, but the research has shown that principal walkthroughs generally does not make any change in the behavior of the teacher, nor does it make any improvement in the student learning. So the principal might well use the time that he spends in doing walkthroughs and working with the community, even though some people may say, oh, he's not doing his job because he should be here in the school. He's doing his job if he's working with the community. And the third role then of the administrator in this process is to provide support to what needs to be done. I'm letting you have the time to read what's on your slides, which says that many teachers are reluctant to discuss some of the differences. They say, I taught them, but they just didn't learn it. And of course, if they didn't learn it, you didn't teach it. You have a question?
Curtis, did you have a question?
John, the question for you from Curtis.
Oh, yes, I see that. Yeah.
Okay.
What does a PLC in a school look like? We're going to talk about that in detail. Is that okay? If you hang on there, we're going to get to that process in just a moment. Right now, we're talking about what the PLC looks like from the administrator's point of view. And we've got an administrator who has established a climate that establishes trust and is not just verbal, but is active support. It involves the community, and he provides the support, for example, such as teacher time. They always say there isn't enough time to let teachers meet together and collaborate. Well, I would like to remind you that time is constant. We all have 24/7. That's the standard. What is the variable? The variable is what you do with that time. And there are many ways that you can use the time. The administrator can find the time for teachers to meet and do collaborating. For example, some of the schools we find give up teaching on Friday. The students don't come in on Friday. The teachers meet, and they spend the time, and that improves learning more than the class. It also gives the students a chance to have an extra day off. In some other instances, some classes are shortened on some days, like on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and that allows the collaborative team to meet. And collaborative team is the next stage that we're talking about in the PLC, what it looks like. First, there is the change in administrators. The next is, what do the teachers do? So we find collaborative teams, and collaborative teams, Mishkind has selected several things that they do, and you can read those, but I'd like to talk with you about some of the other team tasks that they have. The first important one is the team building, and this is the messy part, which slows down maybe the gains, but is the vital part, that they learn how to work together, they learn how to have a goal. There's someone who is a facilitator of that team, and if that doesn't work out, it's not just teachers getting together and talking about, oh, I like this or I don't like that, or you're making a gripe session. There's always a focus. The team time must be spent wisely, because too much time is not available. So teacher openness to addressing the problems that they have is another important thing. They must be willing to talk about that and talk about what they might do that will help to build that process. The second major class of the teaching collaborative team is to select the standards or really we're asking, what do the students need to know? We're going back to the beginning ESL. What does the beginning ESL student need to know before he moves on to the next level, whether it's a higher level of beginning or whether it's going on to the intermediate level? The next teacher needs to be sure that the student coming to her is going to know exactly what they're going to know. Otherwise, they're going to stay in that other beginning level. That's a vital part of moving through the PLC. So the teachers work together and they decide what it is that must be, what standards are necessary. And there are a lot of supports. Many of you will be attending the CC standards courses. You can get standards from them. You can get standards from your state standards. You can get standards from many other sources, or you can just get together. One important thing is that when you're selecting those standards for students, that they not be just content or knowledge standards. Process standards are, for the 21st century, equally important. Students need to know how to reason, how to think, and so that needs to be combined with the topic of the knowledge that they're learning at that time. So this planning of the collaborative classroom takes creativity. You need to know what the students want to do. And research and practice tell us that adult students especially can take greater responsibility for their learning. Too often we treat the students as if they're large children rather than they're really adults and can take responsibility for their own learning. They can be treated as intelligent, serious people. And I probably don't need to tell you, if you're signed up for this program, you're the kind of people that are already doing that. Some of the effective proven approaches are using one of my favorites, and that's project-based or problem-based learning. This gives the students the opportunity to be solving a problem or developing some kind of project that they are really interested in, and they work in groups, just as they will have to in business or industry in the 21st century, to work together. The competitive industry model has disappeared. Everybody works in groups now, and every indication is that that will happen in the future as well. Another that you may not be familiar with is the Universal Design for Learning, UDL, as it's referred to. And research studies have told us that the different parts of the students' brains are operating according to what they're doing. For example, if they're learning knowledge, one part of the brain is operating. If they're doing something with that knowledge, is the second part of the PLC objective, another part of the brain is working. But perhaps most important of all is the third part, and that is, why are they doing it? That's the affective part. That tells us what is the motivation. And many of you, in answering the first question before this webinar started, indicated the students learn when it relates to what they need to know, what they want to know, what they're interested in. And this is the third part of the UDL. So if you're not familiar with that, you might go onto Google and just type UDL. You'll find a lot of information about that. Another is scaffolding material for students. And I think you're probably all familiar with that phrase. And that is that when your students are learning something, they have to learn it in small steps rather than in great big hunks. So how do you break it down and scaffold it for them? One of the ways of scaffolding that is also effective is the gradual release of responsibility, which is now on your screen. And that's the one that Fisher and Fry write about. You'll find it in your references at the end of this session. What happens in this process is that the teacher models something and shows the students how to do it. Next, the student and the teacher do it together. Next, the students do it together. There's 2 students or 3 students. And finally, the student is able to do it by themselves. So they gradually, you release the responsibility for the students. A very important and effective technique. The next part of the collaborative classroom is using formative assessments that we've already mentioned. That's assessments, again, for learning. One of the most effective assessments is the use of rubrics, and that's simply a device where across the top of the rubric you may have beginning level, intermediate level, advanced level, or whatever you want. If you're thinking of job things, it may be an apprentice all the way to a professional. And then down the side of that rubric are the tasks. And then you're able to, in the little squares that go in between, mark where the student is in the progress of a particular task from beginning to advanced. Students can help you develop those rubrics, and they can keep them themselves as well as you're keeping them, and that lets them take the responsibility for that learning. So other kinds of collaborative experiences in the classroom, we have found, for example, that you may not have thought about it, but team writing is very effective. Put 2 students together and let them write something as a team. Let them read things as a team and discuss it. The teacher's role changes, and also the use of technology, blended learning that takes place in this, so that your classroom may look more like a I don't want to say a 3-ring circus, but I can say a 3-ring event where some students are working in teams, some students are working on project-based or problem-based, or maybe the part of the class is worked on problem-based, and part of it is done in teams, part of it isn't done by the instructor. When they find that all of the teams need something, then that's the time for presentation. It's not just a matter of stand and deliver for everyone. Everyone is doing something that they need to learn, and they become motivated. They're less likely to drop out. And if you use both the community and you use technology, it's particularly effective. So I'd like to ask you now if you have any questions. We got that one question. I hope that answered the question for you of what happens in the PLC, because there are the 3 parts. There is the part the administrator does, there's the part the teachers do in their teams, and thirdly there's the collaborative classroom, which is one of the things we've just described, all the things that are going in the classroom. And if we have all of those 3 working in a systemic way, then the student gaining really surges. And that's why I'm a particular proponent of the PLC. So I'm looking now to see if we have some questions. We have one that wants to know, how would the collaborative classroom correspond to the Scrum process used in the tech industry? And I'm afraid I can't answer that for you because I'm not familiar with the Scrum process in industry. Sorry about that, but
John, we had a question.
Discuss that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, we had a question earlier. Someone asked, what about learning walks?
Learning blocks?
Learning walks? WALKS?
That's another device that I can't speak to effectively. There are probably some of you out there that know, but I don't want to talk about it because I'm not familiar with it. Someone asked a question also about blended learning. Blended learning is something that's going to be especially important for the 21st century because all your students are becoming familiar with technology. But technology should not be driving the learning. Technology is another part of learning what they need to know, what they need to do, and how they enjoy doing this. So it's the blending of the technology with the comments. You might use flipped learning, for example. That's very popular today, where the students view something at home, a video or something, and then when you come into the classroom, you discuss it in the classroom rather than doing it the other way around, of showing them the video in the classroom and then giving them homework. So that's been fairly successful. Are there any other questions that I haven't caught on my screen?
It looks like a couple more people are typing, so maybe we want to pause for a moment to give them a chance.
And yes, comments are welcome, not just questions. I see that some of you are using the Scrum in your web design. I'm going to have to do some work on that.
We had a question that asked, how about the use of peer evaluation?
Peer evaluation is a wonderful way. That's a basic part of problem-based and project-based learning. That it's built into the project that they're working on or into the problems that they're solving, and they help each other to learn as they go along. The teacher doesn't always have to be the answer. Oftentimes, as with now, many of you know things that I don't know, such as the Scrum technique, and I see you're teaching each other on your messages that somebody knows about that, and you can contact each other about that, and that's one of the wonderful basis of peer evaluation and peer learning. You're asking a very good question, Curtis, about PLCs, how they come to be, whether they impose from the top or they rise up from the teachers. Both are important, but they have to work together. One of the things that we didn't talk about that is often a deterrent to the success of a PLC, and that is that you have some teachers who don't want to do it. And if you're going to have a PLC, it needs to be inclusive, so that the principal, in one of his roles, when he's hiring, that's the question he should certainly be asking new hires. Are you willing to work with a collaborative team and help them to do things collaboratively? Can you give up some of your decision making to the teachers? Because it's the teachers who should decide on the standards and not the administrator. So on the other hand, the administrator has some rules that they have to live with, and that's why he's part of the process or she's part of the process to say, no, that's something we can't do. So it's a two-way stream. I don't understand where you say some good. Elizabeth says some good, some not so good at your site. Okay. Oh, Dana said it started by the administration but continued by the teachers. And most of the people who have the PLCs, if they find the reluctant teacher, for example, I work with Karen Barroso a lot in the New Haven adult system, and the administrator is firm there that if the teachers are not willing to work in that process when they get back to the classroom, they don't do what the team has decided they should be doing, then that teacher is removed. So it's a decision that, of course, has to be documented and processed. So you're talking about it's cumbersome, and that's the messy part. That's the part why it takes longer for the student gains to take place. Most of the teachers, even though they say it's messy, they say they would never want to go back to the old system once they get into the the PLC, and it's working. Payment, of course, is teacher time should always be paid, in my belief, so that if the collaborative times are on school time, then the teachers are timed with it. One of the barriers in adult education that the K-12 system doesn't have is that you have so many part-time teachers that sometimes the teacher has to come back in to meet with a collaborative team, whereas in the K-12 system they're there anyway. So it would be wonderful if you had all full-time teachers, but that's probably not going to be something that's going to happen in the immediate future. You're making some wonderful suggestions out there about having your regular meetings. That's one thing I probably should mention in our time here is that many schools start with, for example, they will have a PLC in ESL classes only, or they will have a PLC in ABE classes only. Others have gone full sweep, and every program is going to have a PLC. And given the difficulties with it, you have to think carefully about what your resources are, what the number of teachers are that can work together. In some cases where you may have only one teacher or two teachers in your system, it's hard to have a collaborative team of one. So you may want to connect them online with a teacher in another agency that's part of your system, but so they can work together. And that becomes more of a COP in that process, a community of practice, because you're stepping outside of your own system. Someone has mentioned it's harder to have common formative assessments when there's one teacher per level, and that's true. So you may want to contact another system and see if the ones you have are similar to the ones that another system has. I've put another slide up there that you may want to look at. One question that I meant to ask you earlier that I didn't actually, how many of you do have PLCs? It would be interesting to see, of those of you who are participating, what kind of account we could get. So if you could raise your hand if you do.
Again, to raise your hand. To raise your hand, you'll want to use the little man icon in the middle top of your screen.
Oh, as I suspected, almost all of you do. The question I would ask when you say you have a PLC, what we're finding in adult education more than in K-12 is people, because they have a team of teachers who work collaboratively, they think they have a PLC. But it's only a PLC, really, if that extends into the classroom and extends to the support from the level of the principal. When you have all three of those levels, the principal, the teachers meeting in the teams, and the collaborative activities in the classroom, then you have a real PLC. Somebody, as Linda said, that you have not a total PLC. And you have to start somewhere. So maybe you want to start with the teacher teams, but I hope that you'll be working toward having a systemic PLC in the future, because it really does make an amazing difference in the results that students have in their learning. And students who have gone through PLCs have found that they are more successful in college, they're more successful in the jobs that they take. So there are a lot of reasons for using the system, even though it may be messy. in doing it. There's one comment that I like that you might think about, that PLC is a journey. It's not an event. It's not something that you simply do when you have a PLC. It's something you do over time. Another slide that I put up there for you that you might think about in the classroom activities is the teacher is on what is sometimes called the guide on the side. The teacher time is as a facilitator rather than as a presenter. You designate the classroom time, the recording requirements, you do jigsaw activities, which I'm sure you already do, and written reports and how all of these do. So the teacher becomes an organizer and a facilitator and a guide that makes everything work. I might take just a moment, I see that I have one, to tell you that I think the most successful project-based learning that I ever used with an adult classroom. I wanted to teach an advanced class in ABE about the different kinds of writing and reading, about the genres. And I certainly didn't want to lecture them about that and have them take notes, because there's the old adage of that most of us know, that information from the presenter goes from the notes of the presenter to the notes of the student without affecting the minds of either. And so I said, let's make a magazine. And everybody in the class had to write an article, had to write a poem, had to do a cover design, had to do everything that they did. First, they looked through magazines, found out what the parts were. The New Yorker was a wonderful magazine for showing that about. And then they set up the editorial boards. And that's where, as a presenter, as a teacher, I had to give them some of the criteria that they were looking for. But they, as students, had decided what magazines, what articles were going to be accepted, what short stories were going to be accepted, what cartoons were going to be accepted, and the like. It became their magazine. That was their product. But they learned all those processes, but how they realizing that they were learning them, so that when they went on to college or when they went on to write reports and whatever jobs they were in, they had those skills because they did them over and over until they were publishable for those that were accepted. And they helped one another. One of you asked earlier about peer evaluation. There was a lot of peer evaluation going on in that process. One of the negatives I might mention was that many of them took their parts home and showed them to other people, and the other people found that there were some mistakes in there, grammatical mistakes or others, and that feedback came back to me. Why did you let them make these mistakes? And I said, we all make mistakes. And one of the things that we learn is sometimes the mistakes aren't nearly as important as what we have to say. Somebody has mentioned that you had a program, but it was curtailed by cat flex, yes. But that comes back to that question again. It's a perennial question, and that is, what do you do with your time, and what do you do with your money? There's a shortage of money, no question about it, and time is very, very important. But somebody has to make the decision of how you spend the money and how you spend the time, and both of those should be decisions that are made in order to increase student learning, because that's why we're there. Any other comments that you'd I put a couple of other suggestions that some of you might like to think about in the collaborative classroom, which is, for many people, the hardest things to do. Teachers are probably successful in many of the things that they do in a stand and deliver classroom, but that may not be making the students more productive as a result. They may do better on test scores, but will they do better in real life problem solving and in real life decision making? Raimondo is talking about getting real hands-on experience installing solar. Oh, and the grid alternative, yes, thank you. PBL, somebody wants the definition of PBL. There's two kinds of PBL. There's problem-based learning, where there's some that they want to solve. Let's say the adults want to tackle a problem of transportation in getting to classes on time, and they don't have proper transportation. That might be the problem that they work on. Or it may be a project-based learning where they want to design something that they feel is important. I know we had, when I was teaching in Los Angeles area, the smog was always a constant problem, and so the students chose as one of their problems to resolve is they found out that the tires on their cars were being affected by the smog and all the other things, and they went to meetings of local agencies and made presentations. That is, the students made the presentations of why they needed help in cutting down the emissions, and factories should do that. Whether or not that had any direct effect, but it made the students feel very, very good about being able to do that. And the organizations like the Lions Club or wherever they were impressed with these students, and that's another connection with the community and the school. Armando is telling us that Grid Alternatives is a nonprofit that helps low income lower their electric bill. Oh, thank you. Not a term that I was familiar with. By the way, there are examples of PLCs that, speaking of poverty, I guess is the best term for it. There's some research studies that show that the PLCs have amazing results with students who come from poverty levels. When they go on to college, the students who have gone through a PLC program, they may be the first one in their family to go to college. And we know that going to college is just the first step. Staying in the college is the difficult part. And those students from the PLC, because they've learned those skills of working with each other, helping each other, they're more likely to stay in the college to complete whatever they're working for, whether it's a degree or whether it's a certificate of some kind of participation or whether it's just a job skill. Any other comments that you'd like to share with us in the last few minutes that we have in an hour that's gone by very quickly, for me anyway? I would like to mention that we have at CalPro a PLC Institute. There's one coming up next week, and maybe some of you are going to be in that institute. And we have 2 days next week for the introduction of the PLC, and then there are 3 days in October where the students go back and start their PLCs, and then they come back with what problems they had, what successes they had, and then we work on the next 3 days in completing the PLC process, then those students go back to their sites and teach the other people in their PLCs. In order to come to the PLC Institute, there has to be an administrator as well as a couple of teachers. Thank you, Sylvia, for your comment. I didn't expect you to be here since you probably taught me more than I've ever taught you. Well, thank you, Leslie. I'm glad you liked the PLC Institute. Common Core. Curtis is mentioning the Common Core movement has latched onto the evidence-based findings. I have to say this about if you're selecting your standards from the Common Core, it's really important that you select what your students need. If you look at the standards in those publications, it would take you 10 years to do all of the standards that are in there. So you have to be selective. You have to know your population and select what they need at the levels that you teach. I'm sorry that in some cases you're being forced into that. That's not in keeping with the first level of establishing the trust. It may take time to establish that trust, but if you have a majority of people who want to do that, are willing to do that, then it can be successful. But I don't think if it's rammed down your throats, it's not a PLC, then it's a directive program. Thank you, Teresita. Dana has mentioned that the administrators need the support, and I thoroughly agree with you, and that's why at the Institute, we don't take anyone at the Institute unless the administrator is there. Many times the teachers get blamed for doing the collaborative classroom. I know one example where a teacher was given a low rating because she was doing a jigsaw activity in her classroom, and the administrator came through and said she wasn't teaching because she wasn't standing up in front of the class and doing what he thought was the teaching role. So if the administrator is uninformed, that's a great deterrent. They have to be part of the process for it to be successful. Elizabeth, I agree with you about the PLC. It's one of the most exciting and fun things that I've ever done with the class. By the way, if you didn't know, speaking of PBL, problem-based, project-based learning, right here in California, in Novato, there is an organization which specializes in PBL. They're the National Research Team. It was funded by the Buck Foundation, and it's BIE, Buck Institute for Education. And they have researched, they even have a rubric for collaboration that you can have for free. All the materials are free to you. So again, go on to Google and click on BIE or click into the Buck Institute for Education, and you'll find all those resources. They're wonderful. Yes, I see many of you are wrestling with the standards, and the CALPRO has a standards uh, institute or workshop that's coming up. Some of you may have an opportunity to participate in that. Many of you are saying thank you, and I want to thank you for coming in and joining us today. And I see that our time is down to the last moments, and I wish I could be with you in person. The resources are now on the screen, and that I've selected the 4 or 5 most recent and most important resources that I've used in putting together this presentation. Feel free to use it. If you need other resources, again, contact uh, CalPro, and Ellen, who is our administrative assistant here, can always get in touch with me, and I will get back to you. Thank you again. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, John. As all of you are getting ready to leave us, I do want to remind you and ask that you complete our evaluation that you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner. If you double-click on the evaluation form, that should bring it up for you. And we do ask that you complete the evaluation form to receive your certificate. You can email us at calprohelp@air.org to receive that certificate. I hope that you enjoyed our presentation today. Thank you so much, John, for a wonderful and very informative webinar. And I hope that all of you will join us on our next webinar. Thanks.
Okay, so I have that it's a minute after 1, and I'm going to leave the room open just a little bit to give you guys a little more time to download the handouts if you would like to. Is there anybody who would like more time to download the handout? If so, would you type in the chat pod or raise your hand or somehow indicate to me? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.